Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
More than 100,000 people in the UK have now died within 28 days of testing positive for COVID-19. Less than a year ago, as the pandemic took hold, the government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, said 20,000 deaths would be a good outcome. But within months, we had already passed that number. The vast majority of those who have died were over the age of 75, more than 77,000 people. But this virus has taken young lives too. More than 1,000 were under the age of 45. Behind the numbers, the people and the families still trying to come to terms with what has happened. Our health correspondent, Catherine Burns, has been talking to some of them.
Something really precious has been taken away from me, and it's really hard.
This is a life that's gone, and the impact is huge.
I'm left now with a young family who've got no dad.
My life is destroyed. Everything is gone.
Today we're using candles to represent those who died. One light for every life lost. It started on March the 2nd, the first person to die within 28 days of testing positive for coronavirus. The next day, there were 2 more deaths. In less than 3 weeks, the official death toll was over 450.
You must stay at home.
The Prime Minister announced a national lockdown on March the 23rd. The next day, the official death toll reached 1,000. Richard Nabew died on April the 10th. He was a nurse who worked with elderly people. His daughter Jamie hated not being able to visit him in hospital.
I called him the morning of the day he passed away, and he waved and he said, "Bye, Jamie." And I said, "Bye, Daddy. Speak to you later. I'll call you in the evening." And the evening never came. I never thought he wouldn't come home. Something that I've struggled with is the fact that he was alone, but I find comfort in the fact that every day he knew how loved he was. Yeah. It was the disbelief that this person, my favourite person in the whole world, wasn't here anymore. You haven't had the opportunity to grieve because it feels like the whole world is grieving.
By the time Richard died, the death toll was more than 13,000. But the first wave had peaked. The number of people dying every day began to fall, slowly and gradually. By the start of June, more than 38,000 people had died. In reality, the death toll would have been higher. In the early stages of the pandemic, the figures only included people who tested positive in hospital. Ada Jackson was 90 and had early signs of dementia. But families say she was happy, strong and feisty until COVID came into the care home where she lived.
It started to go from 1 person to 3 people to 5 people. You then started to just think, my goodness, they're not going to be able to stop this. They had the residents locked in their room. I felt helpless, that solitary confinement in the room. I wonder if Ada felt abandoned at that point in time.
Ada died on June the 3rd. She hadn't seen her family since March.
These are human beings. These are people with families. They have lives. They're not just numbers. This is a life that's gone, and the impact is huge.
As summer continued, there was some semblance of normality. Packed beaches, foreign holidays, people were encouraged to eat out, to help out. Every single day, though, there were COVID deaths. The numbers were much lower. On September the 1st, 3 people died. But once again, that number started to climb. There were over 700 deaths in September and more than 5,000 in October. Across the UK, there were new restrictions, but the death rate stayed stubbornly high in November, often with more than 400 people dying a day. Dean Matthews was 42 years old. His wife says he was a big kid who lived for his family. Even when he had to call out an ambulance, she thought he'd be okay.
Just said, "See you later." I didn't hug him, I didn't kiss him, just expecting a couple of days in hospital.
I sent him a selfie, and then he said, "There she is, my gorgeous girl." And I think that was the last time I really spoke to him. That was it really, wasn't it?
Dean died within 18 days of getting a tickly cough. He had 5 children. The youngest is just 7.
He keeps saying, like, "Mum, my head can't understand, like, why he's not coming back," sort of thing. We're still at the point where we kind of struggle to think like, why Dean?
Around a month before Christmas, we were told that we'd be able to have festive bubbles, but the increase in deaths was still speeding up. By December the 12th, COVID had claimed more than 65,000 lives.
Mom, happy birthday to you.
Including 50-year-old Midula Sarwar. She and her husband both caught COVID at the same time.
The day that Mum went into the ICU, so the day that Mum went on a ventilator, Dad was also admitted.
So my wife is there in the same building, in another floor, and she was just fighting for her life.
And you think of all the things. I'm okay. You think of all the things that like you're gonna miss.
Sarwar recovered, but his wife was critically ill for weeks.
I had a diary of every day morning and afternoon. Everything is just written here.
Including the day medics said Sarwar, Rashik and his 14-year-old brother could come and say goodbye.
Doctor was very sorry to say that the time has now come to an end. That was the last time I saw her. And she was so beautiful. She was so pretty. She was so beautiful, the way she was looking when she came to my life 31 years back. So that's the most precious memory I have.
By New Year's Eve, the death toll had reached 76,000. Now it's taken just a few more weeks to get to 100,000. And this is not over yet.
It's a loss that should never have happened. It should never have gotten to that scale.
It's not just 100,000 people, it's 100,000 people whose families are going to miss them for the rest of their lives.
The relatives of just a handful of those who have lost their lives to COVID since March last year. Well, the Prime Minister says he is deeply sorry for every life that has been lost and takes full responsibility for everything the government has done. Speaking at a Downing Street press conference this afternoon, he said the government had done everything it could to minimise the loss of life. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
A strange and frightening drumbeat first emerged.
There have now been 4 deaths from coronavirus in the UK.
Then a horrible and familiar rhythm.
759 have
5,300. 16,006.
39,728 have now died.
The soundtrack of a crisis, nearly a year in the making. A terrible crescendo towards today.
I'm sorry to have to tell you that today the number of deaths recorded from COVID in the UK has surpassed 100,000. And it's hard to compute the sorrow contained in that grim statistic.
Around a third of those who've fallen victim to the disease are among the most vulnerable, the most elderly, in care homes cut off from the outside. Twice patients came into Tai Yilmaz's homes with COVID without a test, bringing the worst.
This thing came in mercilessly.
7 residents died in a week.
These people aren't numbers, they're family, they're people that we look after, we care for. I'm sorry, I get emotional about it, but it's just devastating.
What's it been like for you personally?
Stopping's not an option, is it? I mean, we're dealing with people's lives here. You do whatever it takes. You don't stop.
And the cost of the close down to try to slow the spread of the disease has broken all the wrong records. Anna in Essex was first one of millions put on furlough, then redundant, now on the search for a job, sometimes competing with 200 others.
It was frightening. I went from sort of hero to zero overnight. This time last year, we might have been sitting planning where we were going to go on holiday. Now I'm worried about putting the heating on. It's real worrying times.
The pandemic's absorbed almost all the government's time and focus. But whether on adequate equipment, testing or lockdown itself, ministers have been accused again and again of being too slow at the start.
There's a strong sense, I think, that our government has been behind the curve at every stage, that there's been, if you like, a reluctance to take tough decisions when they needed to be taken.
No government's ever grappled with a problem quite like this, but hoping for the best, the country's experiences are near the worst. Prime Minister, near the start, The hope in government was to contain the numbers to 20,000. It's now 5 times that. What went so wrong?
I am deeply sorry for every life that has been lost, and of course, as Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done. What I can tell you is that we truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can to minimise loss of life and to minimise suffering in what has been a very, very difficult stage and a very, very difficult crisis for our country.
The appearances in Downing Street, the announcements of the daily toll, may feel like a terrible routine. But right now, in these dark days, how the government's run and how we live is hardly normal. Not normal at all. Sophie, there's no getting away from this. This is a horrendous landmark that, of course, no one in the government and no one in the country would have dreamt of this time last year, and certainly wouldn't have hoped for. And even though, of course, everybody hopes the disease spread will start to slow more quickly, everybody wants to see the pace of the vaccine rollout continue as quickly as it's already begun. So much has already happened. The government has expanded hugely, not least to prop up the economy, but also to intervene in all sorts of ways in our lives to try to cope with this emergency. There's also been something of an increase in tension between different parts of the UK, whether that's between Edinburgh and Westminster or even parts of the north and south of England. So even when the disease fades, which of course everybody wants to happen as soon as possible, the after effects, the scars perhaps in some senses, they may be with us for quite some time.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you.
It is not a year anyone will want to remember, nor a year anyone in the health service will ever forget, the head of NHS England declared today. As Boris Johnson gave a personal apology for the 100,000 lives lost to COVID in the United Kingdom, the latest 24-hour figures show a further 1,631 people have died, bringing the official UK total to 100,162. There have been more than 20,000 new cases. Another 279,757 people received their first dose of a vaccine yesterday. 6.8 million people have now received their first jab. The United Kingdom now has one of the highest deaths to population figures in the world, as our Health and Social Care editor, Victoria MacDonald, now reports.
A breath reached for and not found. A patient bewildered, a nurse distressed, a new continuous cough, a high temperature, loss of taste and smell. SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, COVID-19. What we didn't know, what we hadn't heard of, we know now.
The first confirmed death of coronavirus in Britain, an elderly patient with underlying medical conditions. But what now?
11 extraordinarily long months ago, the first official death from COVID-19 in the UK was announced.
Well, you can see it there projected onto the wall of the British Medical Association. More than 100,000 people have died from COVID-19. Not from flu, as some would like us to believe. This is not fake news, not fake numbers. These are real people who have left behind families and loved ones.
In fact, if you take Office for National Statistics data where COVID is mentioned on the death certificate, this suggests the number was actually reached nearly a fortnight ago.
And since then, it's been going up, at almost 1,000 a day. And so actually, we're probably, sadly, at about 120,000 at this time.
At the start of the pandemic, we tried to show the faces of some of those who had died, but quickly there were too many. Yet here is another one. Tony Brown, just 65. He died on March the 29th.
He had all the same symptoms that we've heard about a million times since. Called 111, who said pretty much what we're hearing on TV. They said stay at home and take paracetamol. Meanwhile, on TV, all we heard was stay at home and protect the NHS. And no one ever really told you what worse or bad would look like or at what point you're supposed to go to hospital.
But as his breathing got worse, they did call the paramedics.
Got into the back of the ambulance, was taken to Colchester General Hospital, and within 5 minutes of arriving, he died. He died from a cardiac arrest brought on by respiratory failure because his lungs were already too damaged by the virus to help him stay alive.
Ours are the stories of where we've got it wrong.
Tony's son belongs to COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice UK. Like many, they want an independent inquiry into why the UK has been hit so hard. Early modelling gave us figures ranging from the 500,000 if we did nothing to mitigate the risk to this.
In seasonal flu, the number of deaths is thought to be about 8,000 excess deaths. So if we can get this down to numbers 20,000 and below, that's a good outcome in terms of where we would hope to get to with this outbreak.
Understandably, the government doesn't like international comparisons. Countries test differently and have different ways of registering deaths. But these are the figures considered the best you can get. From the World Health Organization, and there is a time lag here, the UK now has the highest number of deaths in Europe and the 5th highest number of deaths globally, with only the US, Brazil, India and Mexico recording more. And from Johns Hopkins University, looking at deaths per million in each population, we're second behind Portugal.
You can make broad comparisons, absolutely. And the broad comparison is that we've done very badly indeed. But cases today were right down in the reported case, right down in the 20,000s. It looks like the deaths will have plateaued. It looks like, you know, the number of new admissions to hospital is definitely coming down now overall. These are very positive signs. And this country, because it's rolling out the vaccine so well, is going to show a dramatic improvement, I think, in March.
This milestone was acknowledged by a Prime Minister who himself had suffered so badly from COVID-19.
On this day, I should just really repeat that I am deeply sorry for every life that has been lost. And of course, as Prime Minister, I take full responsibility for everything that the government has done. What I can tell you is that we truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can to minimise loss of life.
And all of this from a virus that didn't even have a name until the 11th of February last year.
I've been speaking with the SAGE advisor and the government's former chief scientific advisor, Professor Sir Mark Walpott. And I began by asking him if he ever imagined we would reach 100,000 deaths when the pandemic began.
Well, it is an unimaginable number, but of course, you'll remember that Neil Ferguson, when he did his projections, it said that when, if this was unmitigated, the death toll could be as high as 500,000. And so it is an absolutely dreadful outcome, and there are lots of lessons to be learned. But pandemic infection is one of nature's major killers.
Inevitably, people are going to want to know where we are on the pandemic journey.
We are at an absolutely critical phase, and I think that the temptation of people to think that as soon as the numbers start coming down, we can relax the social distancing, that's a completely fallacious view. And equally, people who've had their first dose of vaccine are going to have to remain very, very careful because it takes time to work.
But does that not summon us, therefore, to consider actually moving on to yet a higher level of lockdown?
The bottom line is that we are going to have to be really rigorous in obeying the rules as they stand at the moment. And of course, the reality is that the amount of moving around, so driving, going into work, is much higher than it was during the first lockdown at the end of March, the beginning of April. So we are going to have to be very, very careful.
Very, very careful, but a short, sharp shock might surely produce something quite fundamental.
Well, the more social distancing, the faster the virus will decay because it won't be able to move from one person to another. I mean, the numbers are coming down reasonably at the moment. They're not so well in all parts of the country. And I think the government is going to have to look at further restrictions depending on the response.
So, Mark, where do you think we'll be a year from now?
I hope in a very different and better place a year from now. But it does depend on rolling out vaccine across the world. And will we be completely back to normal? I'm not sure about that because the coronavirus is now in human populations and will remain with us. But hopefully it will be reduced to the ranks of the other nasty infections, and influenza still kills somewhere between 10 and maybe 20,000 in a bad year every year. And so coronavirus deaths will be part of the landscape of human disease, but hopefully at a level that we are able to live with more easily, and the pandemic itself will be in severe decline.
Sir Mark Walpole, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
When so many people are dying from the virus in what is still a losing battle, each day is as dreadful as the next. But every so often, and with distressing regularity and speed, we reach a new landmark of loss. Today, that loss reached the most significant figure yet, 100,000. To think, a week before the first lockdown in March, we were told that 20,000 deaths would be a good outcome. In fact, more than that have died since Christmas, barely a month ago. The Prime Minister said the government had done everything it could and, looking burdened by the weight of it all, he said he took full responsibility. It was, he said, hard to compute the sorrow that the figure represented. Our UK editor Paul Brand reports.
We have many of their photos, but their number is almost impossible to picture. Few stadiums could hold them. Few towns could house them. 100,000 dead in the 10 months since Darryl Blakely became one of the first.
My mask was just full of tears and steamed up. It was so upsetting.
In March, his son Jonathan's words were the first we'd heard from any family member.
He would have been horrified that 100,000 people have followed him. It's like being in grief limbo. We haven't fully grieved for my father. We had a small funeral service, but we couldn't have a proper commemoration. And we still haven't been able to inter his ashes because we've been on lockdown.
Few Prime Ministers have ever lost so many lives at home as today Boris Johnson announced a toll more than twice as bad as the Blitz.
It's hard to compute the sorrow contained in that grim statistic. The years of life lost, the family gatherings not attended, and for so many relatives, the missed chance even to say goodbye. I offer my deepest condolences to everyone who's lost a loved one.
There was a time we might have mourned far fewer.
20,000 and below, that's a good outcome.
That projection was on the 17th of March. The figure was reached by the 21st of April. While the numbers subsided during summer, deaths had passed 50,000 by November the 11th. A second lockdown saw them plateau, but once again they have since spiked, doubling to 100,000 in just over 2 months.
Prime Minister, 20,000 deaths was once described as a good outcome. How would you describe the outcome of 100,000 deaths that you've presided over?
Paul, I think that you'd exhaust the thesaurus of misery. It's an appalling and tragic loss of life. We truly did everything we could and continue to do everything that we can.
And this was a projection doctors, nurses, carers had done so much to avoid too, as tonight others marked the milestone.
We've got the highest death rate in the world, and we're the first country in Europe to hit this milestone, and that is not a place that anybody wanted us to be in, and I think there are searching questions about that.
And tonight we were warned many more photos will be added still. We are a long way from seeing the final picture of this pandemic. Paul Brand, ITV News.
Within those 100,000 much treasured lives, individual tragedies add up to form trends. Geraint Vincent has been examining the latest available data to understand more about where the virus has struck the hardest.
She loved a handbag, and it was the one thing that she wanted when she was in the hospital. Like, where's my bag? Where's my bag? I can't bring myself to empty it. I can't bring myself to take the things out of it.
Sarah Parker's mum, Margaret, died from the coronavirus just before Christmas. 1 week earlier, in the same hospital, Margaret had sat at the bedside of her partner, Pete, and held his hand as he passed away. He too died from COVID-19.
They thought they wouldn't catch it. It's, it wouldn't affect them. It was something on the telly. It was happening to other people. But just going out, doing what they were allowed to do, shopping, they've caught it, and it's cost them their lives.
Margaret and Pete lived in the West Midlands, an area with the third highest death rate in the UK, behind the northeast of England, where it stands at 185 per 100,000, and the northwest, where it's 195 per 100,000.
My dad was a massive Aston Villa fan, and this is his shirt, or one of his shirts, that we'll keep and remember him by.
Kevin Hughes died from coronavirus a week into the new year. Lockdown meant that his neighbours couldn't come to his funeral, so the night before they gathered outside his home.
Nothing felt better to Dad than helping other people, and anyone who knew him would vouch for that. He was a brilliant, brilliant family man. We had such fun as kids. We always felt loved and spoiled, and had fantastic Christmases and holidays and everything else. We should be able to all get together, have some food together, console each other. We're just not able to do it. It's just awful.
Of those people who died within 28 days of testing positive for COVID, most were over 80 years old. Just under a quarter were in their 70s, and 10% were, like Kevin, in their 60s.
If you lose someone, you kind of try and hold on to anything at all that, reminds you of that person.
Via treasures the pot plant which belonged to her best friend, Kenneth, who died from the coronavirus in April. They were both nurses in London hospitals.
I have his picture in my bedroom, and when I look at him, sometimes I look away because I just have this question like, how are you dead? You're so alive to me. You're such a big part of my life, and you're just gone suddenly. Sometimes I dream about him, and it's so vivid. Like I can remember his voice.
Kenneth was 33 years old and from the Philippines. Data from the Office for National Statistics found that in the first wave of the pandemic in England and Wales, 10% of deaths involving COVID were among ethnic minority groups. But the death rate in almost all of those groups, says the ONS, was higher than among the white population. While she mourns her friend, Via is still working on the front line of the pandemic.
I don't think we can live with ourselves if we walked away at that moment when we were the ones the world depends on to put an end or at least help those people who are suffering. If 100,000 people has at least 5 people who love them, that's a lot of people that's been affected. Sorry.
The death toll will climb still further in the weeks to come. Already, so many have lost so much. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
And let's speak to both our political editor, Robert Peston, and our health editor, Emily Morgan. If I could come to you first, Robert. What do you think went so wrong to make us one of the worst hit countries in the world by COVID?
Well, look, let's be under no illusion. The death rate, given the size of our population, is terrible. It is, for a country of our wealth and our size, pretty much the worst. Now, it is true that Western countries in general have performed much worse than Asian ones, who were much better at targeting where the virus was breaking out and then forcing people to stay at home and quarantine. But even within Europe, our death rate is more than twice that of a country like Germany. We have performed exceptionally badly. Now, some of that is to do with the structure of the country and how we live. Unfortunately, obese people are more vulnerable, and I'm afraid the statistics show we do have more obese people. We have more deprived people who have suffered really badly. We have a lot of people living in cramped accommodation. Again, more vulnerable. But there have also been really serious policy errors. We did not have enough testing capacity early enough, and then it took us a long time to increase it. We allowed too many sick people with the virus to go into care homes. We didn't lock down early enough, many would say. The Prime Minister was told to lock down in September, and he didn't. And then we were allowed to mix at Christmas against what many people were saying was the best advice, and we have paid a massive price for all of that. So when the Prime Minister says that he did everything he could, there will be many, many people who said, well, you could have done a lot better.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Emily, you followed this, every day over this last year, and after 100,000 people have lost their lives, looking to the future, where do you think we go from here?
Well, I think we should probably view the future in two ways, in the short term and in the long term. And in the short term, I'm afraid things do not look good. We are going to see this death toll rise significantly. It will continue to rise over the next few weeks. And that's mainly because we're only just beginning to hear of the patients dying who contracted this disease at the end of December and over Christmas. And of course, at that time, we were recording some of the biggest daily cases at that time, around 60,000, 70,000 a day. So it's going to take a long time for that daily death toll to start coming down. Hospital admissions too will remain high over the next week, if not two. It's still reflecting cases at the beginning of January. For the long term, though, things do look better as the transmission starts to come down and more people get vaccinated. Since the lockdown, cases have gone down dramatically, around 20,000 a day, and 1 in 8 of us have now been vaccinated. The government says that we are on target to vaccinate 4 of the most vulnerable groups by mid-February. And if you think that 88% of the deaths were in those groups, you can really see that by the end of February, deaths should hopefully have come down, and we'll see a fall in the number of people having severe illness from this virus.
I really hope so. Thank you, Emily.
Tonight, the first person in the UK to die after contracting coronavirus, a woman in her 70s in the Royal Berkshire Hospital. In just 10 months, we've reached this devastating figure, everyone a life. Good evening. The Prime Minister said today that it is hard to compute the sorrow as the number of recorded UK COVID deaths reached 100,162. Most of us never imagined this mountain of loss and grief back in March last year. If we had, would we or should we have done things differently? Boris Johnson said of the government, we truly did everything we could. Many will come to their own judgment on that. When the pandemic is over, there'll be multiple inquiries and conferences and academic papers. Phrases like lessons learned and the benefit of hindsight will be bandied about, but by then it'll be all too late. It's while we're in this maelstrom that we have to maximise our efforts to overcome this deadly virus. In a moment, we'll discuss where we go from here. But first, here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, with the reckoning so far.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry to have to tell you that today the number of deaths recorded from COVID in the UK has surpassed 100,000.
For nearly one long, terrible year, it has been the drumbeat of our lives.
5,373 sadly have died. 6,159 have, I'm very sorry to say, died.
The daily reminder of how many have lost theirs.
15,464 have now died.
It has climbed higher and higher.
29,427 have very sadly died.
And 5 times as high as those in charge said it would be if this had all gone well.
If we can get this down to numbers 20,000 and below, that's a good outcome in terms of where we would hope to get to with this outbreak, but I mean, it's still horrible.
For so many, it's felt like time stopped in March 2020, like our lives were put on hold. But for more than 100,000 of our fellow citizens, our mums, dads, grandparents, uncles, aunts and siblings, their fate was far worse. $100,162 people have died within 28 days of a COVID test. That's roughly 1 in 660 British people. That's the capacity of Wembley Stadium, and then some more. It's roughly 128 Airbuses at full capacity, 114 Eurostar trains, the population of Carlisle or Exeter or Derry, more than all the casualties of every war the United Kingdom has fought since 1945. 14 times more. And remember, this is likely a conservative estimate. Excess death figures are best to fully capture the effects of the pandemic, and they have been increasing again. Since 2020, they're running at 110,100 higher, 15% higher than the norm. And though it is a little difficult to compare, the UK is at the very top of the table in terms of international deaths, with 1,400 COVID deaths per million. Behind every single one of these, someone who meant something to someone else.
I'd say it was quite traumatic to see someone so healthy and vivacious go from living a full life to being gone in the space of 2 or 3 weeks. And I would say that a very big part of who I am was because of my dad. And I've never felt so lost before.
Unlike the last great pandemic of 1918, this has been a plague primarily on our old, not young. Its victims, those enjoying their later years, their years of rest, to enjoy their families, and they them. Because 78% of all deaths have been those aged 80 or over. The biggest single group of deaths have been those aged 90 or over. But this isn't the whole story, because you're also more likely to be an ethnic minority if you died from this disease, more likely to be poor, and more likely to have to go out and work for your living, unable to sit at home working from your laptop. This list of 100,000 people is dominated by the old and all too often the working class. People who work in factories, more likely to die than those who work in offices. People who are in caring professions, 3 times more likely to die than those who are in the professional classes. Indeed, it is all too credible that if you lost your life from this disease and you are young, you are trying to prevent someone else from losing theirs. This January is about to surpass April as the deadliest month, with nearly 24,000 deaths and 5 days still to go. Indeed, this winter has been even deadlier than the spring. And whatever the month, it has been care homes, which have been one of the most tragic theatres of this virological war. Over the sweep of the year, that figure didn't stop climbing. Indeed, as of this week, we now know that nearly 23,000 people have died in care homes from COVID-19 in England and Wales alone. That's about 1 in 14 of the entire care home population. A minister once famously said that a protective ring had been placed around our care homes. The figures tell a different story. One of the sadder things about today is that it isn't even an ending. The drumbeat will get longer and louder still. The Prime Minister said the government had done all it could. The thing that must haunt us is whether that's right, or whether different choices at different times might have meant that the daily rhythm had been all the quieter, and the pain of those of us left behind all the lesser.
Lewis Goodall, we asked the government to discuss this, but they declined. We're joined by Joe Goodman, the co-founder of the campaign group COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice UK, Tobias Elwood, Conservative MP and Chairman of the Defence Select Committee, and Professor Callum Semple, Professor of Outbreak Medicine at the University of Liverpool and a member of SAGE, though he is appearing tonight in a personal capacity. Good evening to all of you. If I could begin with you, Joe Goodman. Your father very sadly died of COVID in April. Tell me what happened.
Yeah, my dad, Stuart, was 72. He had a number of underlying health conditions which made him particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, to the extent that my family were really concerned looking at the risk factors because they looked like a checklist of his health conditions. Despite this, he was one of the many thousands who contracted COVID in the week before the first lockdown. We think most likely at a hospital appointment because no protective measures like PPE and distancing had been put in place at that point, despite the vulnerability of the people who were there. Because of how vulnerable he was and his health conditions, he unfortunately deteriorated really rapidly, and it was incredibly difficult watching someone you love go from being full of life to gasping for breath and fearing for their lives in a matter of days. He was one of the 20,000 first deaths that were considered to have been a good outcome if that was where we ended up. And obviously for all of us who were among that number, it was anything but a good outcome. But it really is hard to believe that we've actually found ourselves here with 100,000 deaths, and when you know the impact of that on a family and how it can tear a family apart.
Well, I wonder, just to ask you about that, and Boris Johnson said today that he was deeply sorry for every life lost, and I wonder how your life has been since April when you lost your dad.
It's obviously everyone's lives have been turned upside down, and it's been a very strange existence for all of us. It's been a really difficult time to grieve. Often it can feel like I'm not seeing my dad in the same way as I'm not seeing other people, and he's just kind of missing in the same way so many people are from our lives. Obviously having very restricted funerals, and not being able to get the usual support that you'd get, it's been incredibly difficult. But I think one of the hardest things for many of us has been watching the same mistakes being made again and again, and feeling that the lessons haven't been learned, and to know that all of these individual and family tragedies are happening when it feels that so many could have been prevented.
Thank you very much for that. And I know that your brother has had COVID and at the moment has long COVID. Callum Sempo, you heard Joe there talk about 20,000 being a good outcome. Of course, that's what Patrick Vallon said way back in March. Did you think that we would be over 100,000 at this time?
Sadly, I and some of my colleagues did think that this could happen, and we're very worried about it. And the numbers, however, that we hear today belie the many times that number of people that have been damaged. They'll recover, but their lives will be changed by COVID. It's been awful for us.
Do you think it had to be this way?
There's been some bad luck with the evolution of this more virulent, transmissible strain. But we've also had decades of underinvestment in a national health service that's left with no stretch capacity, and a public health authority that's been eroded as well. And that probably has had some impact in where we are today. But as far as the absolute numbers, Britain, for these problems, is very good at counting. We have got very good data systems, we've got very good research streams, so we have very good information about the numbers of deaths. But each one of these is a tragedy. But could we have done much to change that? I'm not sure we could have.
I wonder, though, and what you make of saving lives and protecting the NHS. Now, you talk about underinvestment, but I wonder where you think we are with the NHS right now.
We're hopefully just starting to turn the corner with the reduction in the number of absolute deaths and a number of admissions to hospital, but our intensive cares are still at full stretch. I'm hearing of patients being moved from district general hospitals throughout the country into the larger regional intensive care units because of lack of capacity in some areas. So we're not out of this yet, but we're just starting to see the first bit of light following the recent Tier 4 restrictions.
I wonder, bringing you in, Tobias, we're just coming back to what Patrick Vallon said about 20,000 being a good outcome and it now being more than 5 times that amount. Do you find that shocking?
I do. Can I just express my condolences to Joe? It's a stark reminder of the loss that every family, so many families are going through up and down the country. And we need in the longer term to find a fitting way to remember those lives. We're not out of this yet. Sadly, the numbers will continue to increase. And the Prime Minister was right to say today that there are huge lessons to be learned. There is no playbook for any government across the world to follow here. My worry is, speaking from a defence perspective, biosecurity perspective, is it won't be another 100 years before the next pandemic comes around. It is so important that we get better at locking down, we get better at securing the PPE that we need, better at producing those track and trace systems, better at protecting our care homes, better at securing our borders.
You know, if you talk about sort of looking back at what we could have done better, perhaps we can look back now and say, well, we probably know, and we definitely know a lot more than we did in the March lockdown. And if I can just give you 3 examples, just let's take 3 things. Going back to March, did we lock down too late in March? Was Eat Out to Help Out a good idea? Was the relaxation over Christmas a good idea? Was not closing airports a good idea? is it fair to say that all these did contribute to the infection rate?
Looking back, you have to say yes to all of that. These are the very tough decisions that not just this government, but every government is making in trying to balance tackling COVID-19 as well as keeping our economy open. And a third aspect of that, which is the will of the nation, the compliance of the nation, that consensus that you need. We're not an authoritarian state here, and we need to take the nation with us. But absolutely, we can look back and say, and learn from those mistakes to say how we could have done things differently. There are other aspects about Britain that we shouldn't forget. We are a global hub here. We bring people together from the east and the west, so closing down. We're a busy island with packed urban centres. It could have spread faster, around in the country from that perspective. There are so many questions to be answered in the longer term, which may have contribute to the numbers being higher in this country than elsewhere.
Well, but coming back to you, Joe, I mean, let's talk about your work with families, the bereaved families for justice. You want an inquiry, not in the future. You want an inquiry right now. You've got the vaccine, we're going to have the vaccine rolled out to the most vulnerable. The two questions here, first of all, on a personal capacity, will you feel safer then? Do you think that will change your outlook about your own future?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly the rollout of the vaccine is something really positive and something that hopefully does bring the end of the pandemic in sight. But I think the messaging throughout from the government that there'll be a time to learn lessons at the end of the pandemic has been incredibly dangerous. We were first calling on the government to instigate a rapid review inquiry in early June. And we weren't calling at that point to divert a lot of resources into, looking at absolutely everything that went wrong. Certainly, eventually, I want some clear answers on why what happened to my dad did. But I understand that right now the priority has to be on practical learning that can save lives. And I think for those of us who lost people early on, to see now that we have people who are newly bereaved coming into our support group every day, and their stories look so similar to our own, one has to ask the question that if a rapid inquiry had been held in the summer when case numbers were lower, when there was less pressure on government and the NHS, whether potentially very many of these lives could have been saved.
Tobias, well, that surely is a fair question.
It is. I absolutely agree with that. Everybody talks about comparing with this with a war footing, the experience during the war itself. You have to be resilient. You have to be flexible. You have to learn on the go. You cannot wait till it's all over.
So there should have been an inquiry in the summer.
Well, there were some inquiries on different levels, and there will be further inquiries as well. I conducted an inquiry with my committee. Why isn't the armed forces doing more? They're an asset that we could use in a much greater capacity. Jeremy Hunt's health committee did a study in this as well. But you're right, I think it would have been wise for the government to look at this too. We are far from out of the woods here. We have another 6 more months to go. The positive aspect of this, in that we've had weaknesses, the strengths that we have is in our life sciences, in our investment in the R&D. We are ahead of many other countries in getting that vaccine out. So we will get out of the woods quicker than others. We are saving lives at the moment. But that shouldn't prevent us during this time, because people are still facing death, still facing this illness, to look at what happened in the last 6 months and learn from it.
Callum Semple, just what Tobias Elwood says, and you indeed said yourself, we are not out of the woods. We have more than 100,000 deaths, recorded deaths from COVID. How many more deaths? What order of deaths do you think that we are going to realistically have to face in the coming 6 months?
Well, I'll probably get held for what I say here, but it would really not surprise me if we're looking at another 40 or 50,000 deaths before this burns out. The deaths on the way up are likely to be mirrored by a number of deaths on the way down in this wave, and each one again is a tragedy, and each one represents also probably 4 or 5 people that survive, but who are damaged by COVID. But on the other side, must express huge thanks to the scientific community and the medical community. The death rate in hospital back in March, April, May time was round about 1 in 3. And now it's sitting at between 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 to 1 in 6, thanks to learning from the medical teams about how to ventilate people and use oxygen better, the discovery of the steroids and other new drugs that are coming online now. So there's a lot to be thankful for. That the NHS has done great work, the science has done great work, but we're absolutely not out of this.
And finally, just briefly to you, Callum, do you think this is a once-in-a-generation crisis?
No, I'm so sorry, it's not. I think we're now reaping the reward for having pushed into jungle areas, having exposed us to animals which carry these viruses. There's a lot of environmental issues going on, again with global warming. If the temperatures rise, then we see changes in insects and mosquitoes carrying viruses into different parts of the world. That's causing new diseases in Southern Europe and in the Americas. Now that we're pushing into jungle areas, we're getting exposed to viruses such as SARS, MERS, and occasionally Ebola virus too. So I suspect in the next 20 years, we'll see something similar to this, albeit not on the scale that we've just had.
Thank you all very much indeed for taking part tonight.